Can everyone hear us? Are we audible? Hello. Okay, I see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I can hear myself through the stream. Okay, that is perfect.
Great.
Hello, everyone. You're still watching IndiE3 2014. What's up? We got 2 more panels for today. One now and then one in the next hour. Right now, I'm here with Austin Walker, Lana Polansky, Ansh, and Patrick Lindsey. And they're going to come here to talk about the intersection of criticism and game development. And I'm going to take a little step back, and I'm going to let them talk and say what they have to say. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Alani. How's it going, everybody? Hey, Internet.
Good.
Let's start off really quick and do like the professional thing, which is we'll introduce ourselves and really just a really quick rundown of what our relationship is with criticism and development, what we've worked on recently, and then we'll turn to start talking about some of our topics. I'm Austin Walker. You can find me on Twitter at Austin_Walker. The criticism I write is up at clockworkworlds.com. I also do some streaming at a channel called Stream Friends, which is twitch.tv/streamfriends, and there's archives of that stuff at streamfriends.tv. And earlier this year, I developed a game called A Century, which you can play at acentury.net, ASCENTURY.net. And I'm currently working on a new tabletop card-driven RPG with Jack DeKeat, who was on IndiE3 yesterday or Tuesday, I think maybe, to talk about some of the work that he's done with his game company called the Tall Trees. What about you guys? What have you guys been working on? Where can people find you?
I guess I'll go. I'm Lana Polansky. You can find me on Twitter at LanaTheGun101. I'm an independent, appropriately enough, game critic and writer and zinester and developer. And I mostly work with Twine and Construct too, but I've also branched out into Game Maker kind of stuff. You can find most of my work at sufficientlyhuman.com, which is funded by Patreon. If you enjoy that and maybe consider want to support me. I have in the past I largely wrote as a freelance writer, and I have lots of work from Kill Screen where I started out. I used to write at Bit Creature, I used to write at medium difficulty, and all that stuff you can find on my WordPress portfolio, which I'll throw up in the chat later. That's me.
Ansh, just really quick, Ansh, I want to make sure, is your last name Patel? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
I've been telling people all day, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be on a panel with Ansh, and then I'm like, wait, I know Patrick's last name, I know Lana's last name, and it's kind of not great that I don't know Ansh's, so... How about you, Ansh?
So I'm Ansh, and I go by the name Like Narcissus on Twitter, and I have been developing games for the past year. Some of them are just few experimental prototypes made during game jams. But one of the significant games which I had made was actually a Twine game, which was titled Woman, and it was on the cultural differences in the feminist movement between the West and the Islamic Arab. And currently I'm working on a game called Exist. It's a philosophical horror adventure based on existentialism and societal prejudice, and it's still not quite in alpha stage, but it's closing there. But yeah, so that's on my development side. Criticism side, I am just getting back into criticism after a long break. I used to review games for a national site here, and it was fairly to the score-based reviews, and mostly of AAA games. I wrote criticism on my blog and occasionally on that site as well. So yeah, that's pretty much on me.
Great.
Patrick?
Hi everyone, I am Patrick Lindsey. You can find me on Twitter at HanFreakinSolo. My primary role, I guess, is critic and loud, angry person. I founded my own site, Pixels Are Death, back in 2011, and that's still going. It's primarily a review site, but we do publish some longer form features as well. My own writing is kind of all over the place. I've written for Paste, I've written for Unwinnable, Kill Screen, and I publish a lot of stuff on my personal blog, patrickwlindsey.tumblr.com. It's where all of my good pitches go to die.
I feel you.
Yeah. I am also I dabble a little bit in development. Mostly Twine, actually pretty much exclusively Twine. I worked on Depression Quest back in 2013 as a co-writer. I'm currently working on another smaller Twine game called Dipso, which is about alcoholism. So I make fun stuff. And I am also in the process of writing a book on Far Cry 2.
That's a pretty good thing to be writing a book about. Let's.
I
A
think,
very
I think
interesting
so.
game and in previously the articles which you've written on Far Cry 2, you have discussed many good points. So can't wait for that.
So when Patrick first pitched me this panel, I actually didn't understand what you were doing, because all I'd heard was, oh, it's the intersection of criticism and development. And so for my ears, I'd heard that as, oh, this is going to be about how working on things like the podcast that Patrick does, the Indie Megacast, which you guys should check out.
I totally
That's
didn't
okay.
mention that. I also co-host the Indie Megacast.
How that might bring you into contact with development from the critical side. And I was like, oh, well, that's not really like a thing that I deal with that often. But then later I found out that what you actually had in mind, what we're going to be talking about here today, is the way in which our criticism informs our development of games, and vice versa, how our development of games has kind of maybe affected the way that we think about game criticism at large, and how the tools and ideas can kind of overlap between those two spaces. Do you guys want to talk? Let's just talk really broadly here. In general, did you guys start doing criticism first or development? What was your first entry into either one of these spaces?
Criticism for me.
Same, yeah.
It's interesting. Well, my first writing is my first pieces of writing are not worth looking at. Obviously, they were a little less critical, and I think it was more to do with just enthusiasm, that having discovered the medium and finding it very fascinating.
Sure.
And then as I became more ingrained in the various communities of video games, I learned of some of the attitudes that are sort of prevalent in the community, and those really started to inform my work. And I was also a student at the time. I was still going to college when I started writing. I was 19, and I've sort of grown up as my writing has grown up, and so my audience has sort of like watched me grow into adulthood as I've been writing, which is kind of interesting.
That's awesome.
What about Ansh or Patrick? What about you guys? Did you guys start as critics, or how early was development?
My story actually is very similar to Lana's. I started writing, I guess I wouldn't really call it game criticism, but words about video games. And then over a period of years, I started reading more and more critics, and exposing myself to different types of writing about games, and really started to take an interest in mechanical analysis of games, and narrative analysis of games, and specifically how those two inform each other. And that kind of became my my focus. And then
you helped make Depression Quest, which I think is a game that
Yeah.
people point to a lot as a very easy to digest example of how those two things can inform each other, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. It was definitely an attempt to marry those two things in a way that did service to the medium. I mean, the reason I started branching into development was because I started getting ideas that I would think, oh, this would actually work better as a game, because the mechanical expression of this idea, I think, is actually more impactful than me just writing a couple of paragraphs about it.
I totally understand that. And we'll come back to that for sure. I think that's going to be a big question for us.
Yeah.
Ansh, what about you? What was your first entry point into one of these fields?
I actually began with development. I am a computer engineering student, so I began developing small apps and small short scripts and programs in my initial time. Not games specifically, but just simple codes and scripts. I began writing reviews for a long time. It was, I think, around since 2008. But it was mostly score-based reviews and reviews which divided each game into specific categories and simply analyzed them in a very superficial manner. I didn't get into the more serious analytical criticism until I came across Brendan Keogh's book on Spec Ops, the line "Killing is harmless." Yeah. So after that, I came across a lot of these blogs. I read some of Tim Rogers' reviews, and so after that, I really began thinking of that I should write all these. So I began my own blog and began frequently writing these things. Not on just on the site which I was writing for, but also on my blog. At a point somewhere last year, when I was few months into as an independent game developer, I realized that there were aspects of game design in general which I was not happy with at all, and a lot of them dealt with issues of racism or diversity representation, which I had talked in the previous panel. So I'll not really get into that here, but so I thought that the best way to actually implement those things, that implement the criticism which I had just made, was to actually make a game on it. Right. So it began as a small prototype, and it eventually became a long-term project. So
was your feeling there? Was your feeling there that there was a limit to what you could accomplish with the criticism, or was it kind of like a passionate, like just an urge, like an unresistible, I have to make a game that is the thing I'm not seeing in the world, or what?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was more of an extension to the criticism which I had. I mean, there's this aspect where sometimes there's a very distinct disconnect between theory and the practical. I experienced that as a computer engineer, where a lot of aspects which the books teach in theory and what you actually apply when you actually sit down to code something are fairly different. So when I write criticism, I often see it as a theory because it's in words. But when you put it in action, how does it matter? What are the obstacles? Sometimes the obstacles are not purely in the design sense. Sometimes the obstacles can even be in a programming sense. It can be limitations of what you can code, what the engine can handle, something technical. Right. So there are a lot of these aspects which I came across as barriers, but that's the part, like when you develop something and you are a critique, so you can find ways to sidestep or at least explore new avenues through your criticism.
Yeah, that's definitely what I found too. There was the first game I made was A Century earlier this year, and I made that for the Cyberpunk Game Jam because I anticipated that the majority of those games would be this certain vision of Cyberpunk that I can enjoy kind of from this distance. Patrick just wrote a piece about Cyberpunk in games that kind of makes this a similar distinction here, which is like the kind of hyper fetishized tech, like a kind of techno fetishization, the neon lights, all the accoutrements of Cyberpunk without any sort of political push or without something that I could feel comfortable with, or that I felt was taking a critical stance. I always say it. I don't want to explain my game. That's not what I'm here to do. But so I decided at that point, hey, maybe I should stop kind of whining about this and make a thing that represents this alternative reading. That mostly because I felt like my words at that point would fail me, right? That like there was something that I could do with kind of the algorithmic language with the language of Twine in this specific case, right? In with the variables and the choices that I could give players that I couldn't do in just or even a really strong rhetorical argument. Like I'd get some people like nodding their heads with a decent piece, but my hope was that I'd get people to play and replay and kind of submerge themselves in a game that I made. And so like that draw ended up being really tough to turn away from. Like I ended up it was one of those things like staying up all night to work on this thing and solving development problems and design problems and feeling like so, I don't know, like way more rewarding or rewarding in a different way than even making a big critical breakthrough. Have you guys had similar experiences, Lana and Patrick, going from criticism to development?
Tons of that. So something that was brought up that I'm sort of turning over in my head is this idea of like the sort of theoretical aspect of language and the more practical or applied feeling of an interactive experience. And from a design standpoint, they both have elements of practical and theoretical. Because I'm in all cases, I'm using a kind of language to try to elicit a specific effect. And so, but I guess because when I'm using just pure text, which is static text, obviously fewer things can go wrong because there are fewer systems at play. But, I mean, the things that can go wrong are maybe a little more subtle. I won't get feedback from a piece of software telling me, like, there's an error on line 13. That's not going to happen, but I will get a response from my audience. Or, I will get... I mean, I guess the closest thing to that would be, like autocorrect. Telling me that something is wrong. But I need eyes. I need somebody who can pick up on context and subtext. But, I mean... the feeling of reward for getting something right when I'm developing a game is definitely very different. I think it's because it for me personally, there is a gendered aspect to feeling like I did something right when it comes to development, because one of the things that kept me out of development for so long was this feeling of that I didn't belong there, of alienation.
Right.
And I didn't have the skills growing up, or I was very discouraged from developing the skills that would allow me to do that, and I'm still not very strong with programming. But so when I do get something right, it's more than just that I've succeeded, because I mean I can write an article with my hands tied behind my back. I can succeed at that fairly well, but it's old hat. When I get something right in programming, or if I get something right, even when it's just with a macro and Twine,
right.
It feels like I've broken a barrier. That somebody told me that I couldn't do this thing, and I can do it. And it feels really good.
Yeah, that was... I mentioned my friend Jack DeKeat earlier. He's kind of like toying around with a thing in Twine right now. And a couple of days ago, he came and he was like, I have this problem. I want to have a thing that assigns gender to random characters so that it uses the right pronouns for them throughout the game. And we were like, well, does this match up with what our gender politics say? Like, how do we want this to work out? And yesterday, like, we like both had this moment of like really just inspired, like, oh, this is how the systems can work. Like, this is how we can include a vast array of gendered pronouns that are not directly tied to specific names, so that you can have Mike be a she, because that's totally viable. Like, I'm not going to tell a person named Mike that they can't take female pronouns. And we figured out how to code that, and that moment was like this great example of our critical theoretical interests inspiring us and pushing us to work through the development challenge, the design challenge, and the coding challenge to make that appear in the game text. And that feels really powerful, because it's not, again, it's like what Lana just said, which is like, it's not just dead words on a page. And I love dead words on a page. I read a lot of dead words on a page.
I've spent my life practicing dead words on a page. I must like them.
Exactly. But then seeing that thing work, or understanding how to make it work, we're still obviously making it work right now, but having that moment where, yes, I was encouraged because of my theoretical background to take the extra steps to make it work here, felt really good, and a different sort of good than just, oh, that was a clever turn of phrase, or oh, that was an effective argument. I think a lot of this has relevance to Patrick's work. Again, I don't want to like keep harping on Depression Quest, but you took a really important topic with mental health, a topic that games rarely touch, and when they touch it in the worst possible way, with a lot of demonization and a lot of exploitation. And you provided what I think was a very helpful look at depression for a lot of people who didn't understand the way depression can, and mental health in general, can affect how we are and our kind of, not just an overall state of being, but the options we have and don't have because of this thing that's out of our control. How what were the kind of what's the background for you there, and how did you go about tackling that with Depression Quest?
Well, when the idea was first born, we were both looking for a way to tackle the subject. I mean, it came out of a really tumultuous time in both of our lives, and I remember I personally was just sitting there like in my room one day and just decided, the only way I can process what's happening is to make a game out of this. And I started talking to Zoe, and then she had the idea to turn it into the Twine game that it eventually became. And one of the things that was super important early on was there have been a few games that have dealt with depression as kind of the theme, as opposed to just the MacGuffin. But a lot of times what you see is games will wrap that up in several layers of symbolism, or make it very kind of abstract, which is definitely a respectable approach, and I can appreciate the mechanical design that goes into that. The issue that I have is I had not yet seen a game that actually conveyed what depression was. I had played a lot of games that presented some really good metaphors that said basically depression is like this, but it's because it's such a phenomenological illness, it's so hard to kind of explain it in common terms to people. So I really felt very strongly that kind of wrapping it up in all this symbolism and all these layers was actually sort of doing a disservice to understanding of it. So I wrote, when development first started, I wrote a blog post just kind of explaining where we were coming from, and one of the things I said was that we really wanted Depression Quest to be a cudgel instead of a scalpel, because I think that's kind of what that topic needs. Is just, it needs to be very open and very overt and very blunt, and not try and hide things behind doors. And that was kind of the guiding principle that informed a lot of Zoe's mechanical implementation later on. Like the strike through mechanic was kind of the big thing that came out of that. We talked about the thing we wanted to convey was this feeling of frustration, because there's always this tension between knowing what you're supposed to do and knowing what the correct choice is, and just not being able to. There's this disconnect between your cognitive brain and the part of your brain that's controlling your body, and that was kind of what came out of those discussions as far as how we could convey that.
Awesome. So for any of you here, how did the transition from doing only...
Before actually we get to that point, I want to make a quick point about something you said. I think one of the important aspects of marrying these two fields, criticism and development, is the fact that the process when you actually make the game, it's a very experiential process, and that is very different from the traditional development, which is rigid design, where you create a game design document and you really strictly follow it as a golden rule, like a Bible. And that's the aspect of this crit dev or criticism developer, which I really like, is that as you're developing, you're constantly critiquing your own work and you're open to changes. So it's almost like a conversation you're having with the game itself, and the idea which formed that game. And the more you interact with the idea, the more you get to know the actual game and your idea even better.
This is an interesting...
Go ahead, Lana, sorry.
This is an interesting and very important distinction for me, actually, because I feel like when I started out, it took me a while to even realize that I was actually a critic, because nobody called it that. Everyone called it journalism. And so I was pretty adamant when I realized that's what I was doing, that's what I was doing, and I would get angry with people if they called me a journalist. And so, but I realized when I started getting into development more, which was sort of like Twine was the sort of gateway drug for me, and I'm sure it was for a lot of people too. When I started getting that, I realized that what I was doing was I was putting on different mantles depending on what I was creating. And when I did that, for me, there was very little sort of muddling. There's very little overlap when I was wearing one mantle or the other. It'd be kind of a consecutive but not simultaneous.
Right, you
So when I
switch
was-
fully
switch
from right.
yeah.
Right.
So, you go into writing mode and then you go into editing mode. Well, when I was developing, I'd go from developer mode or creative mode, and then I'd switch over when I was looking at my work, and I'd go into critical mode. And I found that it was harder for me to switch out of creative mode, and that, because I'm not a very good editor either. Like, I get too close to my work. So I'm the kind of person who, like, seeks a second opinion, because I really don't trust my own. Because I have too much confidence in my own arguments or my own sort of creations, my own expressions of things. So I need somebody who will, like, slow me down.
Lay down the law.
Yeah, draw a line somewhere. And it's sort of been interesting to watch myself go switching in between roles, switching the mindset that's necessary to go from the very passionate, very close, fiery kind of space I'm in when I'm making something, and then go out of that and go into a critical headspace where I'm trying to have a certain distance to see what I'm looking at.
Yeah, that distance brings me to an actually good point, because now I do not know personally how long all of your projects have been,
Sure.
but if in a long-term project, it often becomes very difficult to switch in between the modes, and those modes start merging in, and
Yes.
it becomes very difficult to differentiate when you have to critique and when you have to go into creative mode, and that becomes a really big frustrating part of development.
Absolutely.
because then you are constantly stuck in a rut, and you're not able to move aside, and you basically become your own harshest critique, and that becomes a major barrier for the development of the game itself.
Yeah, sort of when when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is why, if you're in a major studio or even in a small studio, but a team of developers, tasks are delegated across a bunch of different people. And yeah, obviously you do critique the game as you develop it, but as it seems like, and maybe I'm completely off here, but in a larger studio especially, that delegation has the effect of allowing the worker to only focus on finishing their little chunk of the project and not having to interrogate how they might interrogate it if they just saw it as a complete finished work in front of them. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah, that's actually, I don't know if it's because the development that I do is almost entirely in Twine, or if it's because I tend to work by myself on projects, but my reason for writing pieces and my reason for writing Twine games is identical. It's always, I get an idea for something that I want to say, and then it's just a process of determining if I can just write 1,500 words on it, or if there's a better way I can kind of express that, which is where this game that I'm working on now came from. But there's no real guiding design rhetoric. It's the process is very similar. It's more just sort of, okay, so I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write this. I might have an idea for a specific mechanic that I want to implement, but that might totally change or evolve or adapt or get thrown out as it goes along because of any number of reasons. So it's kind of a constantly evolving process. I'm very careful to keep the one sort of core element that I wanted to convey intact, because that's sort of what I'm looking to. But other than that, it's pretty much a similar process writing articles versus writing games. The only difference is when I'm working in Twine, I spend way more time stumbling over JavaScript macros.
And Ansh, you came into it the other way, right? Like, you came into it as a developer first, who then... So, like, what about that? What about the other side of that conversation, where do you see your critical work taking on a unique character, or a different character than people like us who started writing criticism first and then stumbled into development? Do you think that there's something in your writing that reveals your background as a designer or as a developer first?
Possibly. I used to write long before I got into development, but it was not game specific. And
Right.
likewise, my development before I got into game criticism wasn't game specific. So yeah.
Sure.
In my writing, I guess the most common thing I see is that I often look at the game as often a collection of systems, or have the, like, whenever I'm playing a game for review, often when the gameplay switches onto a cutscene or there's any kind of interaction, I often the fact of the physics or the actual interaction, the AI movement, the AI code, what could have possibly been done to always keeps on rolling in the back of my mind as a developer, that okay, the programmer of this game must have done this so as to make the character behave in this manner. And the thing is that after actually getting into game development, all of these aspects are becoming a lot more clearer. It may be partly due to the reason that a lot of indie games we play right now are made in Unity, and my engine of choice is Unity. So it's pretty clear when you look at a Unity game, it has been made in Unity. Even though it is a very diverse engine. So yeah, I think a lot of my analytical writing has been is primarily dissecting systems and how they affect the game. But one of my favorite parts about writing has been the player-character interaction, the how that this is a unique medium which allows the player as a participant, and how when I'm coding that, how do I allow the player to interact with this game? Is it in a more direct sense in terms of interaction with objects, or is it in a more abstract sense where he's just interacting, like in the case of game which I'm making, with his thoughts, and the thoughts indirectly change and shape the flow of the environment, the flow of the game. It's I think the more of a stream of consciousness would be the more direct comparison to the kind of workflow which I'm trying to implement into this game. So the main difference, which I would say, would be that you tend to recognize games in a more mechanical sense. You try to appreciate what the mechanics does to do to the actual game, how they serve the purpose, or more than what they do, what you see when you criticize as a developer is what they do not do. What are the limitations of the tech? What are the limitations of basic mathematics? When you actually code a simple script, a simple AI script, there are always going to be a lot of big restrictions of maths, or the kind of restrictions which the engine imposes, or the kind of restrictions which the hardware imposes. So
what are some of those? What are some of the important restrictions there in Unity, and then for Lana and Patrick in Twine, that you guys have run up against, especially with regard to your ability to dive into your kind of critics toolbox, your theory toolbox, and putting that stuff to work? Have you guys hit hard walls there that have been either something that you had to work really hard to overcome because of built-in limitations in development engines, or that you just really couldn't overcome at all? I guess Ansh especially, because I'm really curious about Unity, because so much of what we're seeing right now is coming out of Unity.
Yeah, definitely. But have Lana and Patrick say it for the Twine first, because I need to think, because there's a lot of things about Unity which can be discussed at this point. So yeah, so I would rather have Lana and Patrick go first on Twine.
Oh, okay. So I guess some of the things I've run into have been more conceptual than mechanical, although I guess some of them do manifest in mechanical ways. So like there's a big assumption with Twine that it's non-visual because it's hypertext, which is actually not the case. It is quite possible to embed video, to change fonts, to have very cool sort of visual effects, to have images. In fact, I have one game I made is almost entirely of images. But what is, like you can't have animations, for instance, or you can maybe have, I think it's possible to have animated GIFs, but you can't really have like an exploratory dynamic space the way you can in a Unity game. There's no like top-down perspective. There's no 3D perspective. There's visual dimension is not really a thing in Twine.
Yeah. Also, kind of along those lines, Twine is very premeditated.
Yeah.
it doesn't do random very well. It's very good at displaying exactly what you want it to display, but if there's anything that you're trying to convey that necessitates any sort of flux or any sort of, I don't want to say proceduralness, but for lack of a better word, it's not great for that. I've actually had a couple of projects that have stalled out because that was kind of the core thing around which it revolved, and I just couldn't figure out an effective way using things like custom random CSS placements and JavaScript macros. I couldn't figure out a way to make that happen. So those have...
to get that to work, you really have to be quite good.
Yeah, and I mean, I recognize that there are some people who are basically Twine wizards who can do things with it that I can't even believe, and I recognize
Christ for them, because
when
you do figure things out, it provides a tool for you to then yes, I can, and it often opens up not just like, oh, they used it in this way, I can use it in this way, but like, oh, okay, I can use it in this other way that isn't exactly how they deployed it. That does something new and interesting and ties into some other point that I'm trying to do.
Springboards, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's actually a really valuable point, because one of the things that got me into the Twine community was the community itself. Like, one of the things that kept me away from so many other gaming platforms or development platforms was this feeling of the learning curve and of feeling like I had to do it all myself, like nobody would help me. And in fact, if I tried to ask questions, people would just kind of shout at me for not knowing. And I felt like it was worse being a woman and trying to do that. Like, there was almost an expectation that I would just be bad at this stuff and I shouldn't try. And Twine was very different because it was very welcoming to women and queer people and people of color, and it at least built itself that way. And it was one of those things where if I have a question, I will have 6 people trying to answer it for me as nicely as possible and make it very, very clear, very, very foolproof that even if I can't really program, I can sort of get the gist of this.
Yeah, Twine is very simple, but it's also incredibly scalable. So the barrier is incredibly low, and it's almost limitless what you can do with it once you kind of familiarize yourself with the ins and outs of the engine.
Yeah,
that's why we say gateway drug, right? Like it brings you in with plain language, and then it sort of introduces you to other kinds of languages.
Well, and then the other thing that's great about it, right? Like so one, like I definitely want to spend this summer trying to learn bits and pieces of Python for another project that I have in mind. But to Twine's credit too, I have this conversation with a lot of my friends who say, Austin, I really like a few Twine games, but I'm not going to say that I'm a fan of Twine because the majority of them, they don't do anything for me, and I never want to erase that experience. I never want to say like, screw you guys, like you guys should love the thing that someone made over the weekend on Twine just because it's a thing that a single person did or something like that. But what I do tell them is that tools like Twine offer the experience of game development to groups of people who otherwise have been, like Lana said, scared off from really aggressive development communities, or who feel like because of a number of other surrounding issues that they could never possibly, this is what happened with me, could never possibly make a game. I'm just not smart enough in that way, or whatever. And in a sense, the journal is a really important thing that we have. It allows us as individuals to work on the craft of writing, and the craft of writing is great. It's fulfilling. It's transformative, and game development is all of those things too. And so Twine for me is, even if it's not for mass consumption, it allows a big group of people to have the experience of designing something, overcoming design challenges, thinking about laying out a non-linear or even a linear experience, right? Like both of those things can be really important, knowing when to transition from one page to another. That is, I don't want to come off as like I do want to come off as a Marxist here, right? But like this is the Marxian dream, right? Like this is the Marxist utopia.
You're in the right
I get to craft my junk and love it. Like I get to throw myself into my art craft, and have a space to do that and have the tools available to do that. And for me, actually sitting down and developing a thing gave me insight material experiential insight that I didn't have before that. Like I would say all of this shit a year ago, all this stuff a year ago, but I wouldn't know it, and now when I think about solving a design problem, like the hairs on my arms go off because it feels so good,
I think it's what you're saying is incredibly significant, and I think it's not a coincidence that since Twine has kind of exploded into ubiquity, you've seen a lot more of a critical presence in development because of Twine.
Yeah, that's right.
Twine is, it's not explicitly a critic's development tool, but it's very critic friendly because it allows you to exercise those critical capacities in the development world in such a way that doesn't require an incredible background in programming.
Yeah,
it doesn't come as loaded with some of the prerequisites as other platforms do.
Right.
Definitely. I think one of the important things which Twine did was it tore down the wall and made development no longer an exclusive club, because back in the 90s it was like only a magician could code, and there was an entire exclusive club surrounded by people who had an arts degree, or who could animate, who could paint, or who could code, who had a science degree,
or who just had the time to learn those things, not through traditional schooling systems, right?
Exactly. Yes. And
keep going. I'm sorry.
And what it did importantly was that it also it enabled people from different fields, from different walks of life, to actually make these kind of games, which do not require a lot of learning, do not require a lot of higher education in specific fields. And also, what it did for the gaming as a medium, I believe, is that it brought these people and made these Twine games, and they put in their experiences, because I think some of the most popular Twine games that we have seen are either real direct personal experiences, or they are fragments or inspired from personal experiences. So what it did was it enriched the gaming as a medium by offering more diversity and offering the kind of stories which would otherwise never have appeared in mainstream AAA gaming.
What's interesting... Go ahead, Lana.
Well, I want to kind of go back to this idea that, there's people who look at sort of the whole body of Twine and go, a lot of these games, I don't get anything out of them, or they don't speak to me, or they're not relevant to my life. And what I say to that is, most games that you're going to play, like that I play, are pretty alienating to me, actually, and are irrelevant to me. And yet, I don't give up on the whole medium because there's mediocrity or there's chaff. Especially when you democratize a tool, you're going to have a lot more people who are going to make a whole lot more stuff at various skill levels or creativity levels, originality. But what I would say to that is, you don't have to like every individual thing that's made, but you can still kind of find your few gems that speak to you. And by doing that, by supporting the medium or the tool as a whole, or the community as a whole, you allow, just by numbers, in terms of numbers, you allow more people to make more interesting games, and you allow the people who are maybe not so great at it now to feel encouraged to hone their craft if they so choose, and to become better over time, because that's the only way that it's going to happen.
Right.
I know that my first Twine games are pretty simple. There's not much to them. And as I started experimenting a little more with stuff, I got a little bit more ambitious, and I've gotten a little bit better. I'm not saying, not to toot my own horn or anything, that my games are so fantastic, but I've definitely improved, seeing response from people who have encouraged me, or I've gotten some positive feedback or constructive feedback even, that's helped me make better games in the future.
And all this, for me, plays into so two things here. First is that all of this kind of like revelatory experience of how important and personal game development can be has made me invested in the larger political economic critiques that I have around the game development industry. I don't want to get too deep into those right now. I have a different panel tomorrow on that stuff. Please listen to that.
Looking forward to that.
But secondly, it also, this specific model of Twine, I think, Twine comes out, Unity comes out, there's a kind of what people might call a democratization of a tool set. And what's important for me is not to accept that immediately and say, okay, well, in these cases it was good, so all democratization of tool sets is going to should be unchecked, or should be we should be purely enthusiastic about it. I look at things like the release of the new Unreal Engine, the development of the next Unreal Tournament game, which is going to be developed alongside modders and fans with their actual, not just like their input, but like through their labor. I look at the ways in which the Unreal Engine is being kind of cheaply leased out or rented out every month, and also Epic gets a big cut of whatever you end up making out of it. And I love democratization of tool sets. I love development being made easier, but we should remain critical about the labor practices that are pushing those things forward, about the commercial interests, the corporate interests. And who knows where those interests come from? Like, they can come from a lot of different places, but like, as enthusiastic as I can get about development, I'm always careful to like stay on my toes, or I try to be anyway.
So I wanted to step in just because we actually have a question from someone in the chat.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that we got to that.
That's from Vorpal Femme, Delilah. Hey, Delilah, how you doing?
Hi, Delilah.
Hello.
So I guess the question is, do any of you worry that critical perspective can affect the player's experience of a game that you create? Make a game that has a clear rhetoric, do you feel that intent directs players to take a critical perspective before they have an unguided experience? Which I think is a really interesting question.
I think there's like two answers there.
It is an interesting question because it actually... I think it's an interesting question because it also reflects the kind of experiences I've had gaming after I've begun developing games. It's kind of that like when you before I began making games, there was a specific kind of magic of not knowing what goes on behind the screen.
Sure.
But once you start making games, that problem is that kind of there's this demystification of the actual game, and then you start seeing all of that as a collection of systems, a collection of code, and how those things actually work. So there is a lot of demystification to that. So I think probably that thing reflects the same way onto my development process, at least. And
you there?
Hello?
I think we've lost Ansh.
I think we lost Ansh.
Oh no.
Oh, there he is.
Oh, no, there you go. Hey,
there we go. Whew,
yeah, you
close.
lost there for a bit. I want to note something particular is that we've hit 9 o'clock, but I know that we started this late, so I want to know what you all think about going to the 30.
Yeah, it'd be fine.
Oh, I still think...
What? I mean,
Sure.
I could go to midnight, so...
Okay, that's fine. So we can totally
it's
go till
sunrise
9:30. That's great.
Sounds good.
Okay.
9:30 sounds good.
Yeah, that's great. All right, I'll leave you.
Do you want to repeat the end of what you were just saying, Ansh? Because we missed bits of it.
Yeah.
You were talking about the experience of playing games once you understood some of the practices that went into development, and how that changed your experience. The magic was gone, so to speak.
Yeah, the demystification of games basically happened when I began making games, and I think when that happens, when you're developing your own game and simultaneously playing it, that kind of critical look on your own game also tends to color how you actually work through the game. So I think having a really critical perspective on your game definitely has its pros, but it also has its cons, like the aforementioned frustration aspect which I had mentioned before, and also this particular bit which tends to not
Here, this Ansh. I don't know if it's a mic problem or a connection problem. There he is.
Give the player a really critical perspective on when they're actually playing the game.
One thing that... Oh, I'm sorry, did we lose Ansh again?
We did very briefly again.
Oh, okay.
No, you can continue, Patrick.
Okay. It's interesting to hear you say that, Ansh, because I come from almost the exact opposite perspective. As a critic, primarily, my kind of job, I guess, is to make a point. So when I make games in Twine, I'm not so much concerned about providing an interpretive experience that people can kind of read their own perspective into. There is absolutely a specific thing that I'm trying to convey that I want people to take away from it, not irrespective of their own experience, but maybe just over and above that as well. Everything that I've made has been very specifically to convey one specific message or idea or theme, which, I mean, that is largely due to the type of games that I make and the fact that I make them entwined, but I don't typically create, your kind of gamey, quote, fun experiences. I'm more just about games as a different method for conveying an idea than just written words.
I ran into a really big, this was one of the core problems for me when making Eccentury earlier this year. So I'm not going to get too deep on the mechanics of that game, but the big important thing is the game tracks certain variables based on the choices you make. You have a score for whether or not the corporation that you end up kind of directing in that game does something like expand its borders or invest in permanent infrastructure or something like that, right? And one of the things that I realized early on was that I had to make a choice about whether or not to leave those options balanced. So, you could have one corporation, there's two choices. One of them, or there's 5 choices, right? Let's say a number of them might increase your company's technology score, and one of them might increase their environmentalism score. Let's just say that those two things are opposed. And the thing I had to decide early on was, do I want those numbers to equal 0? Do I want them to even out? Or, and I kind of do what Vorpal Femme is saying in the chat, give an unguided experience and just kind of let the players do whatever they want inside of those parameters. And what I decided was one, I don't know that there's ever such a thing as an unguided experience. Right. All experiences are always already guided, unintentionally. And then 2, one of the things that I get to do is push the guidance in a certain direction. So you know what? Yeah, in my dystopian cyberpunk game, it's way harder to be environmentally friendly than it is to be a massive technological military powerhouse, right? I made those numbers, I forced those numbers to represent it because I kind of didn't want to try to take the apolitical stance and say I'm just presenting a fun little toy, a fun playground that doesn't have those influences.
I think that's really interesting for me. That when you're writing, you do have. And it depends what you're writing too, because I've written very direct kind of argumentative essays or personal essays that really get straight to the point, and I've written more poetry or more abstract kind of writing. I've written stream of consciousness writing, which is a little bit more subdued in terms of being didactic. It doesn't really lead you by the hand. And so the question when making games is not whether I'm making an unguided experience, is what structures am I using to direct play in a certain direction?
Right.
And I've always, in my writing, been worried about structural issues in society because I'm very skeptical of agency, the whole construct of agency, especially under, late capitalism, when so many of our decisions are decided for us in very subtle, sort of not very obvious ways by the forces around us. And so when you're making a game, you have to very much directly contend with being the steward of some of those systems, and sometimes that can get uncomfortable too. Also, I want to bring up before I forget about it, I was getting some feedback on Twitter, criticism a little bit of privileging that we've been doing a little bit of the skill of writing, and that math is something that is by a little bit by writers, by language arts people, seen as something very magical, inaccessible, arcane. And my friend is just telling me, for her, in her case, the math has always come much easier to her than writing.
Right.
And so it's a little bit disingenuous to call writing tools like Twine democratizing.
That's absolutely
for
the case. Yeah.
Language people, when math people have difficult access at time. Not necessarily, but there are people who are better at math and have difficulty accessing language.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I have been thinking about a while the past few days is that even if you're not a writer or an essayist, but you're a hard developer, like a coder, there's still some really interesting critical thought that can come out of that camp. One of the things I mentioned on Twitter a few days back was, if you ask a programmer and a critic, their thoughts on the same game, you'll hear two very different conversations.
Yes, that's right.
It's an issue of micro versus macro almost. Whereas as critics, we're kind of trained to look at things thematically and like holistically and kind of get an overall sort of broad stroke sense
in a very big picture kind of.
Yeah.
We just don't see the forest for the trees.
Exactly. Yeah. It's strictly like looking at individual trees, whereas the conversations I've had with developers about games have been really eye-opening because they'll go very granular with specific systems and like the way that this makes like the way that this affects game feel, et cetera, and it's super interesting because their background, their mathematical kind of programmatical background, is giving them this insight that I would never have even thought to look at.
Yeah, I mean, it can be one of the most eye-opening things for me from, getting out of my little writer bubble and getting into programming has been talking to people who are more programming-oriented or math-oriented. And to me, I mean, demystification is a very important thing because before I started any kind of development, it all seemed like wizardry. And it, and I've sort of sobered from that a little bit, and that's actually kind of affected my writing. But one of the other things that I've sort of learned to appreciate and that I've been talking about is taking games for what they are, to being able to observe and describe, even on a granular level, what you're seeing, to not go in loaded with all kinds of assumptions, whether it's as a writer or as a player. And to let the game kind of speak for itself. And that's something that you also have to learn to do with people, right? Like the high school me made all kinds of assumptions about math people that have been unfounded and unfair. And I also experienced that from the other side of, like, from my own experience of being better with language arts, of a lot of my life feeling like I had a useless skill that couldn't get me anywhere.
Yeah.
And so I maybe have a little bit of like a bugaboo about that, and maybe that informs some of my privileging, valorizing of writing a little bit, like I'm a little defensive about it still. And so that's something I have to check sometimes. But definitely just getting so much help from programming people and learning more about it has deepened my appreciation of numeracy, of thinking with the logics of programming and how those are sort of fundamental to understanding how to create these kinds of little virtual worlds and how to use those different logics and think in terms of formal logic, which is something that I didn't really have before. Something that I learned in development that started to inform my writing.
One of the, if not the kind of key thing I really wanted to emphasize in all of the discussions I've had about this topic is that we see criticism as a thing that benefits development, in that, well, we're providing feedback and this, the developers will read reviews and take that into account. But that's actually a two-way street. I think the critical community has a lot to learn from listening to developers as well.
Yes.
And I think it's super, super, super crucial that we kind of open up that channel and encourage more criticism from the development community, just as more critics have been diving into the world of development.
Yeah.
And I know that some sites have started encouraging, like Gamma Sutra always publishes posts from developers and stuff. And I would really, my sort of like utopian dream is for that wall to just be knocked down completely, and just to blur that line, because there's an aspect of criticism in development, and development can really help sharpen your critical acuity as well.
Definitely.
I'm going to agree with that. I had a point, but I lost it.
Oh, no. I will say... Okay.
I think I just got it back.
Good.
Definitely that criticism is not just a pipeline of information, it's a dialogue. For me anyway, that's how I see it, and that's especially an important concept to bring into games, that you're not just creating a one-way experience. somebody is playing and interpreting and internalizing what you're doing, and they're going to take it into their own life, for better or worse, whatever way they're going to do it. And that's something that you sort of take for granted in games, but people can be very defensive of their writing. Developers can be defensive of their games too, don't get me wrong, I have them too. But it's something that it's a little more acceptable when someone's explicitly playing your game, that they're going to be able to be actors rather than just passive audience. And something that I've learned to appreciate more as I've been making games is more the idea that people are going to get whatever they're going to get out of my writing too. And I can't always, I can do my best to steer an experience or steer an idea into a certain direction.
Or respond to critique, right? Like there is, but that you can't control that first read. You can't control that, right?
Yeah, I can't control that.
One of the things, so I'm the project I'm working on now is in fact writing free. It's just a kind of a storytelling system through cards, and that's really tough to anticipate what the response and what actual play is going to be like when it's not me or someone I know playing it, because like I think the system works, but of course I think it does, because I understand how to with another player generate a nice story using these systems, and it's really hard, and we've kind of had to like step back and say like, all right, we're just gonna have to see how it goes when two strangers who don't have the same interests as us, the same backgrounds as Jack and I, the two people who are working on this, like, and again, talking about deprivileging the kind of the writing aspect of Twine games here is one of the reasons I want to talk about this. But like making just a loose set of systems that hangs together fairly well, but it doesn't have any explicit narrative content in it is really scary, and it requires you to step back and say like, all right, like let's see what happens. Like let's see what other people take from this. And I'm definitely more willing to do that, I think, with game development than I have been with writing. Like I am way more, and that's just like a personal thing probably, right? Like I am way more interested in engaging with people who don't get something out of my writing, or even ones who do. I want to know what you got out of it. I want to know like, so it's an interesting dilemma, I think.
Yeah, I think developers can learn a lot from criticism as well, and not just in a very rigid sense. Like a lot of developers look at game reviews anchoring criticism as the kind of feedback in a very strict sense, like what did they like about the game, what did they not like about the game, and they do not look or explore the kind of mindset behind why the critic complained about that particular aspect, or why did he mention that specific point. So trying to explore why the critic, or basically placing yourself in the critic's shoes as a developer, is really good, because it often helps you try to uncover a lot of development aspects which are faulty and which are restrictive. Like for example, there are.
We keep losing you, Ansh. Hopefully you'll come back and tell us this example in a second. Again, this might be a connection problem. This might be a mic problem. His mic sounds so good that I doubt it's a mic problem.
Yeah.
Give it a few more seconds and hopefully he'll return.
Ash, are you there?
Hi, Zolani.
How you doing?
Pretty good. It's a good panel. I'm a pretty good panel right now.
I'm just sitting here listening, that's all.
Oh,
just making sure everything's
disconnected from the and he's
there he is, and he's back.
There he is.
Yeah, I'm back.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
You were about to give us an example of when that happened, and that's when we lost you.
Yeah. So yeah, like I was saying, this RPG leveling up system.
Oh no.
No,
it's equated as a design problem, the RPG leveling system. But it also could be seen from if the developer really dug into the critic's mindset, then he would realize that it's not just that, it's also the programming aspect, because one of the aspects which no designer or no programmer has been able to figure out is how do we actually design a game or make a game around basically an RPG around a battle system which has scalable enemies but also does not use numbers.
Sure.
And relies entirely on skill, but at the same time does not even scare players who are slow to learn or also not really good with those controls, or basically poor to play. So that kind of conflict is something that they could uncover if if they did realize that the criticism is more than simple feedback. It's also
Right.
an invitation
Mhm.
to delve into someone's mindset who thinks from a very different perspective as you do.
That's seems really important. How, in your experience, Ansh, how have you gone about getting that sort of feedback written or given to you? Like, is there any? It feels like it must be like pulling teeth sometime to get good, interesting, and productive feedback.
Definitely. And in the case of long-term projects, there is no feedback because
Right.
you can try sending builds, but I think in long-term projects, the thing is, the big problem is that you really put a lot of yourself into the game, and then you really shy away from really showing it to a lot of people.
Mhm.
And when you are simultaneously critiquing the game, it often develops into a loop where you keep circling around the same point over and over again, constantly reiterating and changing things, trying to constantly improve. So this kind of really bad kind of perfectionism is really harmful in that sense.
Mhm.
But yeah, to answer your question, getting feedback is, I think, a lot easier now than it was a few years back, I suppose, because now we have platforms, especially the kind like Game Jolt and the basic press, the independent press, like the journalists. Like now you have these curation sites like the Forest Ambassador or the Warp Door, and these sites often offer professional opinion about your game, and this could be just a simple game. It could be a simple game jam game. Like for example,
Right.
when I made Bullet Soul Hacker for the Cyberpunk Jam, it was made in a few days, but the kind of feedback I got made me realize that there might be something more to this game than what I had initially explored. So this kind of feedback is important, and there are a lot of platforms you can get it right now. It could be Game Jolt, it could be Congregate, and obviously there's always Twitter. So yeah, so it's not really difficult getting that kind of feedback anymore.
Do you think that there's a space where so the thing with those spaces is that they still more or less privilege development in that those are platforms for the sharing of
Yeah.
games in project or in development or that have been released. And I think a big thing that all of us keep touching on here is that we'd love to see a space where developers and critics can coexist as peers and
Definitely.
have exchange.
Definitely.
What's that
Definitely.
platform look like? Are you guys like? If you,
I think the closest, like initially off the top of my head, that I could think would be like there would be a review, and then as an extension to the review, there would be an interview with the developer, and that interview would not be a simple question answer, but it
Right.
would actually be a discussion on the critical
Right.
aspects which were touched on the review. So
Because
I
they're
think this.
treating games as kind of commercial objects to purchase and devour and
well,
leave
that's
behind.
that's exactly what I was just going to say. Is the current quote review system looks at games? It's a consumer-facing endeavor. It's not a developer-facing endeavor. Reviews, by and large, exist to inform consumer purchase decisions, not so much to enter into a dialogue with the developer to kind of interrogate systems or anything like that.
And I don't want to, uneven-handedly throw that out, right? There are people who have limited budgets and need to make informed purchasing decisions. And,
Oh, no,
and
absolutely.
So like, yeah, I know you're
There's
not.
no
I just want to
value
make sure that
judgment in
our
there.
listeners don't immediately think that that's what we're going for here.
No,
No,
I
it's
throw that out
definitely-
there as a way just more to indicate that it's very easy to conflate reviews with actual like developer-centric criticism because they look very similar, but they actually serve very different purposes.
Yeah, I think the closest thing to what I had said in terms of a review followed by a critical discussion between the developer and the reviewer would be something which I think right now the AV Club has for their TV reviews. They review the episode and then they simultaneously post an interview with the developer, and they discuss a lot of aspects which were touched upon in the review, and the developer, in this case, not the developer, my bad, the show writer or the director in that case of the TV series gives his opinion on what actually he meant by a certain thing, and the reviewer may have viewed it differently. Like in TV shows, in cases like Mad Men, where there are metaphors which may not be too obvious. Sometimes they may be interpreted differently by the reviewer, and they may be which may differ from the original intention of the creator. So having that kind of discussion, I think, is a really fertile platform for really analyzing not just the work which is under the scanner at that point of time, but also in general, it promotes this kind of healthy atmosphere and a healthy medium for something that is more than simple call-answer feedback.
What do you guys think the big obstacle is for spaces like that being created? Like, now that we have, a kind of working strategic idea of what that sort of space might look like, why isn't there one?
I could talk for a whole hour just on that.
And we only have 7 minutes left.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all I can really say, one of the things that would be important to understand about a space like that is that anyone can be one or the other at any given time, depending on what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And that one skill does not trump or privilege the other. And that's actually, it's not a binary. There's so many skills that go into doing both. And so many different perspectives. And there has to be, I would think, a sort of curatorial aspect to this where, free discussion, but, a kind of positive freedom, not one where, people are sort of steering the discussions in sort of structurally kind of unhealthy ways or offensive ways, but obviously a place where people can share a wide variety, a wide spectrum of certain design or critical ideas or outlooks, and that anybody can sort of switch over from one mode to the other whenever it suits them. Whenever a critic can on one day be, I made a game, can you please look at this? And in that case, be a developer. Developers can obviously enter, critical discussions and be just as valid as anyone else there.
Great. And I will add again, if this is kind of a bad self-plug, but like if you're interested in more discussion about why certain sorts of critical spaces are not in existence, check out the panel that I'm in tomorrow night about the intersection of not development, but games under like capitalism, and how those things sort of intersect.
So excited for that.
It's amazing. There's some great people on that panel. Iris Bull is on that panel. Ian Williams, whose article on the closure of CCP Atlanta was run in, where was that run? It was The Guardian, like a week or two ago. It was exceptional. So I'm really excited to be on that panel. I think, Zolani, are you joining us also?
Yeah, I'm going to be sort of half moderating, half conversating, trying to
please join the conversation. I really, really am excited about hearing your perspective on that stuff too.
And if anyone else has any plugs, any shameless plugs, we at IndiE3 support shameless plugs for all the panelists. We have about 5 minutes left. If you want to throw those links out, I recommend you do it soon.
It's not a shameless plug, but I something regarding the process of informing my development with the criticism. I think one of the aspects which I realized was while I was developing Exist was that I have this kind of real tendency to portray real-world issues in my game. So how do I portray them, and how do the existing genre structures prevent me from doing that? So it's basically an adventure game, but what earlier Vorpal Fem had asked regarding a critical experience, a critical mindset trying to would essentially alienate the player from having that kind of untouched experience. In my game, I circumvent that by actually making the character you play as a mystery, so you do not basically know who you're playing as, and it's that same character is also procedurally generated. So every time you start a brand new save file, that character is someone new. So there are specific procedural rules to that. So you do not end up being a white rich man who has suffered under racial and economic oppression, because that basically does not make sense. But what it does is that it allows the player to experience the kind of perspective shift by placing themselves in someone other's shoes. But when they are doing that, they do not exactly know who they are. So it does allow them to experience the game as it is in a really uncritical manner. I'm
really excited for this project you're working on, Ansh. This sounds really good. This sounds great. I'm really hyped.
All right. Oh yeah.
No pressure. No, knock it out of the park, but no pressure.
Probably going to change a few things after today. Yeah, no. I mean, yeah, there is always pressure, and I'm still new at this, so still learning and making it as I go along. But yeah, the point which I wanted to touch here was that there are certain genre restrictions where, for example, let me give a short example about the game. There's this walled city which the player finds themselves in, and depending on their economic background, the player, whether he's rich or poor, they can find themselves in the poor part of the city or the rich part of the city. If they're born poor or they're poor, they get spawned in the poor part of the city. And the thing is that if you're spawned in the poor part of the city, you cannot go to the rich part of the city because you're confronted with gates and massive walls. In any other game, I guess they would have offered you options to try to find a key or unlock the gate and try to explore the rich city, because that is the kind of experience which game design is centered around. Give player power to explore the world, power to do something. But here what this game tries to bring out is the helplessness at your own condition, what you cannot do because basically the system is rigged against you. So even here it offers an illusion. It offers you to do some odd jobs, try to build small ladder pieces to try to jump over the wall to the rich part of the town, but every time the ladder reaches a certain point, it basically crumbles. Now, giving an idea of the post-recession economy, where the rich are supposed to get richer and the poor are supposed to get poorer. And yeah, so basically that was a short example of that. Yeah,
it reminds me a lot of a game called I know we have to wrap up, but I just want to shout out Real Lives 2010, which if you guys haven't played, or no one here has played, everyone should play Real Lives 2010.
I have. It's a great game.
Which also systemically represents the difficulties of moving from some places in the world to other places in the world, from moving through class brackets. That's my one recommendation while we leave this panel. I've been Austin Walker. I'm Austin_Walker on Twitter. You can find my streams at streamfriends.tv and at twitch.tv/streamfriends. You can read my criticism at clockworkworlds.com, and you can play the game I made at acentury.net, ASCENTURY.net. Who have you guys been? I keep saying guys, and I feel like a jerk. Not guys. Who have you people been?
I have been Lana. I have been Lana, and I will continue to be Lana in the future, most likely. Polansky. And
if not, that's fine. If you want to be someone else, just let us know.
I guess I could, but I don't plan. I've been being Lana for a while, at least. If I can just give a quick shout, since we're already mentioning games that we thought were cool. So I'm just going to give a quick shout out to some artists just really worth paying attention to. Lulu Blue, who makes really cool, simple, fun, colorful, awesome games, like Filu Filu Disco and Guy Don Duet. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that well, but it's a really good game. Leo Burke makes awesome games. Jake Clover, Jack King Spooner, Connor Sherlock. Obviously, Liz Ryerson, who's been on a couple times today and who is amazing and who has personally inspired me. There's so many more, but I'm terrible at remembering anything. So maybe I'll just put some in chat that I think are really good. And you can find my work at Sufficiently Human. If you like my work, you can maybe consider supporting it on Patreon. And that's me. Find me on Twitter at LanaTheGun101. I tweet a lot, and I tweet vociferously, so be warned.
I guess I'll go next. I am Patrick Lindsey, and I am extemporaneous, so that will not change. Twitter is kind of my main place at Han Freakin' Solo. All of my writing is all over the internet, so that's probably the best place to keep track of it all.
Yeah, so I'm Ansh, and Light Narcissus on Twitter. You can follow me there, or you can have a look at my site, which is also lightnarcissus.com. The game which I just talked about, it's called Exist, and its site is existgame.com. And yeah, everyone's mentioning games that they like. I think when I mentioned about the demystification of games after I began developing games, I think there are few developers who are exempt from that kind of demystification because their works still endlessly fascinate me. Among them, I would like to give a shout out to the Catamites games.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
sure.
They are incredibly fascinating, and like no matter how much I try to analyze them, there are still so many aspects of it which are very opaque, but at the same time very fascinating. So the Catamites, and of course Stephen Lavelle. I recently played Increpair. I played Slay of God, which
He's
was
fantastic.
which also was he is, and it was just also a very interesting experience, both visually in a pure aesthetic sense. So check out these people's games if you haven't, because they are pretty much right now the best representatives of what you would like to say the avant-garde games of right now.
Can I also just stick in Titouan Millet and James Earl Cox III? For people who are pretty much those guys, and pretty much almost everyone involved with Arcane Kids doing really incredible stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely.
What's it called? Lana noted a lot of the favorite developers are also my favorite developers, but I'm also going to.
Funny that.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. I also want to put in Mason Lindroth as well, who made join on the as well. I mean, that is a good list of people. I run a magazine that likes to talk about games made by those kinds of people. So that's also really cool. And yeah, geez, thank you for talking with us. Thank you for coming here. I really appreciate it, and everyone at IndiE3 appreciates it. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for having us.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you
it's
very
been,
much.
it's been a blast.
This is
Thanks so much.
You guys went past the hour. I was there going, maybe I should just let them go longer, you know?
No,
So,
sorry.
I'm sorry. We're bad.
I'm really glad. That was a great conversation. That was really, really cool. I mean, and that's basically our last panel for the day. We're going to be starting tomorrow, and Saturday is a good day for panels. We're starting tomorrow at 5 o'clock EST, 2 o'clock PST with writing about experimental games. I'm going to be at that panel, so is Lana.
Yeah, I'll be there. We'll probably be talking about a lot of the games I mentioned here. So.
Yeah, I probably will be talking about a lot of those games too. So I mean, that's going to be a good panel. And we also have the video games under capitalism panel, which I'll be conversating with Austin Walker as well. So you're going to see more of Austin. And geez, yeah. Thank you all for watching, everyone. Thank you for watching IndiE3.
Have a great night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good morning.
Have a great morning.
Good day.